Welcome to our Applied Ballardianism Séance. Thank you all for coming, and I will first introduce our two guests. Simon Sellers is, of course, the author of Applied Ballardianism. Otherwise, he's a writer and editor living in Melbourne. For 16 years, he edited the cult website Ballardian, which tracked the influence of J.G. Ballard on popular culture. Applied Ballardianism was his literary debut, and its unofficial sequel is Code Beast, a sci-fi novel about digital ghosts. And our other guest is Maya B. Kronic, formerly known as Robin Mackay, a theorist and the founder and director of the publishing house Urbanomic that published Applied Ballardianism. The publishing house Urbanomic, or the publishing house platform, has among other things initiated three key theoretical paradigms: speculative realism, accelerationism, and neorationalism. And so I already told Maya that we call Kronic an alcoholic in Slovenian, so it's a properly Deleuzian surname in a way. I would also like to thank Škuc and Sophia and Tanja Velagić for organizing this, and Jaka Neon for doing the visual, and of course the technical crew. So let's begin. So Simon, it's 3 a.m. in Melbourne, and we again find you in a very special zone. I'd say, you know, like you're always about locating yourselves in zone, within zone, within zone, like a zone between sleep and insomnia, but also like the zone of creative endeavor, right, of writing. So, like you write in Applied Ballardianism about preparing a paper for the upcoming conference, and I would like to quote you on this one. I had little recollection of my daily activities across the next few weeks, and with 2 days to go before my flight to England, I panicked, believing I had wasted my time with nothing to show for it. But then, combing files for possible material to cobble together, I was astonished to discover the completed paper on my computer. I had no memory of writing it, nor did I have any recollection of arriving at the airport to board my flight to England. That moment also materialized from nowhere, as if I coaxed it into being. End of quote. I see like a sort of connection with that of Coleridge's flower, you know, like also quote, what if you slept, and what if in your sleep you dreamed, and what if in your dream you went to heaven and there plucked a strange and beautiful flower that is this paper, and what if when you awoke you had that flower in your hand? What then? So let's talk about this time sickness or zone sickness and what kind of results it produces.
Well, I think that what you're referring to is it's about my relationship to writing at its heart, which is I've always seen writing as a form of sickness, you know, as a sort of fever that I can't shake, because I find the act of writing very, you know, it's anxiety inducing for me, and puts me into a state where I'm not really sure of what I'm doing, and a constant self-doubt about all of my writing. And so it always amazes me when I manage to produce something at the end of it, and it does become this sort of subconscious retrieval mechanism. I think that passage you're talking to, I always remember reading Burroughs' Naked Lunch for the first time, where he talks about going through that, you know, that junkie sickness, and his friends come over and rescue him and find all these papers on the floor, and it's the pages of Naked Lunch that he's not even conscious of producing. And I think I was sort of playing on that sort of mythology in that passage that you were talking about, that sort of Burroughsian junkie sickness, which is sort of my relationship to writing. And then, of course, there is the zones within zones element as well as you mentioned. I always seem to, you know, because my publisher is in England and a lot of my audience is in Europe, I always seem to find myself up at 3 a.m. talking to people, and in between worlds in that way.
So Maya, is that like a zone for editing?
Huh. Yeah, I mean, editing often happens at 3 o'clock in the morning too. But also there's this particular kind of time warping thing that happens with publishing, where everyone's excited that a book has just come out and you're like just totally sick of it because you spent the last 3 years editing it and designing the cover for it and etc. etc. So you do tend to be in a kind of different temporality. In junglist terms, it would be like the dub plate, you know, the tune that gets played in the club 6 months before it's actually come out and you're hearing the future. But I totally share this relationship to writing that Simon describes. For me, writing is also extremely painful. And one of the best things that happens to me actually is if I can read something that I've written 6 or 7 years ago, and the best ones are the ones that make me laugh. I feel like if it makes me laugh, then somehow I successfully produced something that really exists. But it takes a long time before you feel that about something that you've kind of forced out of yourself. And we were just talking about how this came about, that Urbanomic published Applied Ballardianism. And I was reminded that we met first, appropriately enough, on Facebook, probably at some ungodly time in the early morning. And I think the way it happened was that I somehow had come across an extract that Simon had posted on Facebook. And at the time, I was homeless and living in a field in a tent and having quite a mental breakdown, really. And for some reason, I got the signal from Simon's writing that he was someone who had been through similar periods of distress and who maybe I should talk to. And that was really the origin of when we started talking about Simon's book and how it came to be an Urbanomic publication, was through a kind of mutual recognition of the fact that when writing is really valuable, it's when it comes out of distress and distressing encounters and trying to work out some kind of pressing problem that you can't escape from.
Yeah, so it's also a therapy zone, right? So the funny thing is that we're doing a translation of Nicholas Hausdorff's book Superstructure Berlin that was like originally published at Zero Books. We're doing it right now, and in his foreword to the Slovenian translation, like we did like this Debordian thing, he writes, and I quote, "To not reject paranoia and apophenia, which are perhaps the ultimate, most contemporary and most valid mindsets of the age, but to affirm them in new and unexpected ways." The end of quote. And paranoia and apophenia have, of course, a very important place in the applied Ballardianism. We could almost say that they are the protagonist's main mechanism of thinking and acting. They also get him in all sorts of trouble. And like he's like this main, like well-intentioned but still a gatekeeper, his PhD mentor defines apophenia. He says, broadly speaking, it describes a schizotypal cognitive condition, the mental state of perceiving patterns in meaningless, random, and unrelated data, so kind of like this over-semantic production. But on the other side, we could also say that in the time of social networks and after Jeffrey Epstein, or like for that matter, after Guy Debord, apophenia or paranoia can't have such a bad rap anymore. What do you think of this? Because it's like also like the whole fringe aspect of it, of course, also. Simon, yeah.
Well, in the book, the narrator calls conspiracy theory the people's novel, because it's the only way that sense can be made of a very fragmented and oversaturated world, I guess. I think running through my mind when I was writing those sequences about conspiracy in the book was Ballard's old quote of consuming the media landscape is like dreaming awake. So you have all of these sensory inputs coming in at the end of the day, you're trying to process them together, and what comes out is this sort of surrealist movie. So that's kind of one element of it, and it's sort of amplified and accelerated with the saturated media landscape we have today. But I was also influenced by William Gibson's novel Pattern Recognition, which is all about that that phenomenon of making random connections make sense in I guess the internet age or the social media age, and the sort of strange cults that could arise from that, and the new narratives that people follow. So yeah, I think it's an interesting phenomenon. But talking with Maya just before this started, maybe it's not such an amazing thing nowadays, and maybe it's more commonplace and just a new mode of being that people slip into quite easily and willingly.
Yeah, and one phrase that sticks with me from back in the CCRU days, I'm not sure, maybe it was Sadie Plant who said it, or Nick and Sadie, things are happening before they make sense. I think this is our everyday experience now, is that the models that we've inherited from the past, whether from like authority or from general kind of ambient social conventions, no longer help us to navigate. So therefore, any kind of model is worth trying. And paranoia, after all, is just a model of reality. You take certain elements that you can find and you extrapolate them and you produce a model with which you can navigate. That's the first step. And then I guess the second step is, rather than asking whether that model is a true model of the world, whether it accurately or faithfully represents the world, you just say, pragmatically, what happens if I use this model? What are our choices, really? Our choices are either to be completely disoriented every day in the absence of a model, or just to create our own model, maybe pathological, maybe paranoid, in order to, as Ballard says, find your own destiny, your own, what's the phrase I'm looking for, Simon? Deep.
Yes, it's along those lines. I think that there's another interesting quote that he said, it's like he treats reality as a sort of autopsy, and he's piecing together reality materials to come to some conclusion, which I think fits in with what you're saying there.
Yeah, I'm also reminded of Borges's, I think it's Sloan, and he says about like this, that the narrative that is the most fascinating one is like it's not about truth. Of course, it's like partly a satire, but he says that like the most fascinating narrative, so it can be also like the most paranoid, is like the one that is most valid, not the most, the most veritable one or something.
So one of the great lessons that Ballard teaches us, the phrase I was trying to think of was deep assignments. The principal characters in almost all of Ballard's novels are people who have a crazy, off-kilter, socially unacceptable model of reality, and they just decide, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and do this and see what happens. And that kind of conviction and experimental living out of some kind of paranoid or schizo model of reality is kind of what I saw also happening in Applied Ballardianism.
So yeah, so I think like it is. It's that Ballardian model, but it's also I think we have to remember that Applied Ballardianism is at heart a novel as well. Yeah. And so taking those real world elements and weaving them into that sort of storyline is also a comment on the storytelling process itself. And I find that really interesting as well in Ballard, that it works on that sort of meta level. Yeah, so in that regard, I'm like interested like to this reaction of of the society, or like the mainstream or like the normie world, or whatever the best term for this is, like the figure of a charlatan, like the value of the charlatan, or like the invention of the charlatan. And let's define the charlatan as someone that does not do things in a proper or standard way. Like, I think outsider is like too pleasant of a word, like too euphemistic. Charlatan I like much better. It reminds me of Werner Herzog, who was like after he became famous, he was explaining how in the 70s, when he started doing movies, he had like the whole crew pitted against himself, because he was like doing things in odd way, like in a way that was not like proper procedure. So like the whole, like, of course he's fabulating a lot and sometimes just plainly lying, like Baron Münchhausen or something like that. But he says, like, I had like whole crew against me because I was trying to do something new, and as we know, Herzog kind of pulls it off, like he does these singular sublime movies, like at least in the 70s. So I feel in a very similar way also, like Applied Ballardianism and also like Urbanomic have like this tendency or aspect. Do you think of yourselves, like both of you, as charlatans in any meaningful or non-meaningful way?
Well, certainly not when I was writing the book. I mean, if by charlatan, do you mean the form of the book, the experimental form of the book? Is that what you're referring to, or the way it's this sort of theory fiction model?
I mean, and like the character is like is like pretty usual. It's like like routinely being subjected to like this strange gazes, like like you have the conference situations where you have like big shots there of cultural studies, and there I think they're like looking at this character as a complete charlatan, like, and also like the character himself takes that on himself, and he has all these doubts about himself. So even if he's doing something completely new, there's so much, like different takes on that, So he has to struggle with that also, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's all based on my own struggles within academia. I said that at its heart, Applied Ballardianism is a novel, but it's also the subtitle. It's a memoir. I've always felt really up against the sort of the walls of academia throughout my brief and unsuccessful academic career. I've always had that sort of I always had that tension of wanting to discuss theory but also write fiction at the same time, and was really drawn to Baudrillard and Virilio, who seemed to blend those elements very successfully. But obviously I was not as talented as that. So all of those impulses and instances of those clashes in the book that happen are all derived from my experience of trying to mash these two forms together. And it was only really when I was writing Applied Ballardianism that I really felt that I, out of sheer desperation, that I could try and do that, because I just graduated with my PhD, and I was trying to get that published and still trying to hang on to the remnants of an academic career and, the whole publish or perish impetus, but wanting to write fiction as well. And the two impulses were just, tearing my brain apart. And suddenly out of it came this sort of theory fiction mashup. I'd be interested to talk to Maya more about theory fiction in that regard, because it's the form in itself is, it's quite slippery, hard to define. I don't, I sort of given a sort of very vague reason at how I arrived at it, or how I've arrived at it, but I was very surprised to learn that there was a tradition of this sort of writing as well. So, without really trying, I finally managed to slot myself into somewhere.
I wouldn't
that's
say
a ramp,
exactly a tradition.
there is that's sort of how it came about.
I think it sounds grand to say it's a tradition, but yeah, I mean, it's the first time anyone's asked me if I'm a charlatan. I don't think of myself as a Herzog character, because I think in my editorial relationship with authors, I'm definitely the one being tyrannized rather than the other way around, which is fine. I mean, I can deal with that. But there is definitely, if I could describe Urbanomic in one sentence, it would be in terms of like a continual struggle to remain a misfit, because really the whole impetus behind it came from feeling like a misfit within the world of academic philosophy, and perhaps being a charlatan in the eyes of those who define what philosophy is and isn't. And you know, starting Urbanomic was like this leap in the dark, where I knew like I could be just totally embarrassing myself. I don't know what I'm doing really, but I've got a kind of negative idea of what I don't want to do. I want to do philosophy, but I don't want to do it like that. So at every stage since then, what's happened is, you know, you mentioned at the beginning, you said Urbanomic had played a part in defining 3 theoretical paradigms. That's like exactly what I'm always running away from. It's like, as soon as something like that solidifies, I just want to move on and do something else. And when I met Simon, it was very much at one of those points where I felt about the work that we'd done. I could see that a lot of that stuff around speculative realism had begun to enter into the academy, had begun to become a kind of academic subcategory, had kind of consolidated and become a safe place for people to be. And I needed to move away from that. And one of the ways that I felt one could move away from that is just by working with texts that couldn't be brought into the philosophy canon, because, you know, they had these fictional elements as well as a philosophical or theoretical element. So yeah, this book was definitely like one of the steps in that continual pursuit of wanting to remain a charlatan or a misfit.
Yeah, I mean, we can move to theory fiction. So actually, like the local story in Ljubljana goes something like this. So the main Lacanian journal, which is like the dominant theory in Ljubljana, is called Problemi. So it's like problems, right? And it used to be a journal of both theory and fiction. But then the Lacanian gang took it over in 1968. I'm gravely simplifying, but it is like what it is. So this Lacanian gang introduced the great divide between literature and philosophy, which meant that the writers of fiction had to move and establish their own journal called literatura. So, you know, like the names are pretty nominally taken. And the funny thing was, like 50 years after that, or after this like great divide, when we proposed translating Applied Ballardianism into Slovenian within our publishing house, there were some voices like really against it, like, you know, like saying theory fiction, you know, one can't have theory and fiction, one has to decide, you know, like it's either theory or fiction. And it's exactly, that was exactly the reason why our imprint series exits happened. So in order to be able to do this within the publishing house, and we had support of our main editor. But I'm asking you, Maya, that because like you have within your publishing house, you have like a character, of course, named Reza Negrestani, who is like doing all this theory fiction, you know, divide, like his trajectory from cyclopedia to intelligence and spirit. And he's like this vector or force, like, who is really against mixing theory and fiction, but he at the same time does theory fiction all the time. So I'm wondering what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's important to say that I don't think theory fiction is like a genre that has rules. I think it's a compromise that people arrive at, and people come from different directions. Sometimes people are driven from systematic philosophy. It's hard to speak for the case of Reza and why he's moved away from that, but I know that fiction is still something that he's interested in doing and in writing. For instance, we recently published a book by Gilles Grellet, Theory of the Solitary Sailor, which is a kind of fiction. It's an autobiography, which is deeply philosophical, but it also has, what I would describe as novelistic or fictional elements. And he's come to that from a very different place than Reza came from to write Cyclonopedia. So I think, the point for me with theory and fiction is that they're both, again, to do with models. And why do you create a model of the world? It's because you're in some kind of distress, right? You're in distress because the models and the conventions and the rules of the world that you are led to believe should apply somehow don't apply. Something happens to you which doesn't quite fit in with the way the world is supposed to work, and therefore you create the new model. Now, what a philosopher does is create that model in a very systematic way. The distressing thing that happens to the philosopher is basically like the whole world. The whole world doesn't work as it should do. So I'm going to create another model to describe everything. And I'm going to describe it in this very kind of skeletal, analytic form. I think the novel or the fiction is similarly about creating a model, but it's a model that's not global in the same way. It's a model that's fully furnished with characters and settings and so on. But it's a way of dramatizing and saying, well, what if the world worked by these rules instead? So I think they're both about creating models. And again, in an age where our inherited models of the world simply don't work anymore, then, as Ballard said, science fiction is maybe the best way to understand the present.
Yeah, also like sorry.
Yes, I mean, and you could obviously count many philosophies, if you wanted to look at it that way, within the confines of science fiction. Like, what's Leibniz's monadology if it's not some like weird science fiction about the way the universe works? Yeah. Or even like Hegel's phenomenology is obviously like a Bildungsroman. It's like a novel about the road towards the absolute. So yeah, all of these models already exist within philosophy.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's the way I always saw writers like Virilio as writing this particularly potent form of apocalyptic science fiction. Yeah.
I would also say, like, like the philosophical novel was closely interlinked with the Enlightenment, right? It was like a form of spreading Enlightenment, and theory fiction could be like kind of linked to dark enlightenment, but that's like kind of internal joke. But in a way, you also talk about like more specifically of your registers. Like, for example, Maya prefers K-pulp, as far as I know, and Simon, you often talk about pop cult in your, and I think that would be also like a kind of formula, like when you say culture studies has become a wasteland, like in this kind of awful way, but in a way its potential is also like being a wasteland, like I take Applied Ballardianism exactly as a continuation or discontinuation of cultural studies. It is still like close to that form, but it's doing like something vital and and wonderful again, I'd say.
Well, it is born from that golden era of cultural studies, which I was, found myself involved in at the tail end. Are you saying its value is in laying, if I understand correctly, you're saying its value is in laying waste to those forms? Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
I would say that you're exactly a kind of author that like makes wasteland something interesting, not something, you know, like you say that it has become a wasteland, but actually you're like pro wasteland, you know, like you're an author of the wasteland. I'd say, you know, precisely.
Well, well, at a very literal level, you know, the book is set amongst urban wastelands. It's set amongst urban ruins. It's very preoccupied with finding meaning from those ruins and being reborn in a sense. You know, the narrator always talks about how he is drawn to in-between states and indeterminate states, and how he finds himself in those liminal places. And even, you know, the term liminality has become such a cliche these days. But my inspiration for that was always, you know, those writers who explored urban edgelands, whether it's theoretical or fictional. And yeah, I too, like my narrator, feel very energized when I find myself in those places, where you know, and you know, that's a very Ballardian preoccupation as well. You know, Ballard's characters always finding themselves in the margins of cities and in between urban zones. And I guess it's that sort of that impulse of wanting. Well, if we're talking about an oversaturated world and a world where everything is exposed, it's that impulse of wanting to escape, to find a corner or a region that is unmapped and is away from the gaze, I think. So the digital gaze or whatever. So it's really about escaping into the folds of the map as far as I can see. If that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. There's this great line by Simon in the interview. You two did so many unrealities, which we also translated as the afterword of the Slovenian edition. So you say, like, I read Twitter and I think like my instantaneously like said like this was a meme, you know, like this was the quote, or I read Twitter. So it's like also like for me it was like a mini manifesto that got like instantly ingrained in my head because it resonated with me so strongly. Because like I'm always interested in this question of doing stuff in the age of Twitter, you know, how to write, edit, translate in the time of Twitter. And we also must not forget that like you said with Facebook, Twitter facilitated, for example, my communication with Simon about the translation, you know, like it was the place where we met, you know, it was the place where we started discussing this option, you know, and it's carried on, you know, like also like the first contact was through Twitter, you know, you tweet something and then you start something, and it was really like that age was defining for me. Of course, a lot of things on the Twitter changed. You know, it's not necessarily to do just with the mask acquisition. I think like it got less dense and less intense already before that. So I'm just wondering, what do you think of it? You know, what does I read Twitter mean in 2023? Also, like, what does write, edit, or translate mean in the age of post-literacy, if we can call it like that? And then there's also like a small question of, you know, chat GPT. What's like doing all those things in that age, you know? So we have like age of Twitter and age of chat GPT. I mean, it's a broad question, but I think we can discuss.
I think now retrospectively, I feel like I can date important times in my life by social media networks. So going through Facebook and then immersion in Twitter for a few years and then Instagram. And that, I think for me, there's a value in just like letting go and letting those systems do whatever they do to you, which involves, you know, altering your sense of yourself, your sense of your connection to others, and, you know, sometimes introduces properly like pathological symptoms. But it's an interesting experiment. And how could you be interested in the future and indeed in the present without wanting to have that experience of just letting go and seeing what happens to you? But at the same time, obviously there's something that always is also pulling me back and making me want to take a distance from that in order to write about it. So there's this kind of impossible goal where you want to participate, but you also want to write. And the only way to resolve that, I think, is by letting that experience enter into the style of writing, the way you write. And I think that's something that I saw right from the beginning that Applied Ballardianism had done brilliantly, that the way in which the words were arranged, the way in which the events took place, faithfully channeled something of the disorder and the distress and the exhilaration of what was happening to this character. It wasn't just a description, it was actually like in the style as well.
Yeah, and Simon, do you still, yeah, sorry.
No, it's probably channeling my short attention span.
Well,
so the question, Simon,
that's exactly the question, isn't it? Like you as a novelist, you say you only read Twitter, and yet you go away and you write a 300-page novel. So how do you do those two things consistently?
Well, I think that quote's taken a little out of context. It was, I do actually read books as well.
What?
But I think at the time I was, I think like you, you know, a lot of my major connections and creative breakthroughs have occurred through, you know, things that have been facilitated through social media. But I don't, you know, I don't use it nearly as much as I used to for various reasons. I can remember a time 5 or 6 years ago when I was heavily into Twitter, and I found myself tweeting in my sleep even, and woke up to find that I tweeted William Gibson a photo of our office whiteboard for some reason with with some obscure hieroglyphics. Anyway, I've you know, it's quite remarkable when I look back on my relationship to social media and the things that it has facilitated. Obviously, this book and meeting Maya and so on, but also, you know, various jobs that I've found through social media or that have come to me. To the extent where a lot of my friends are people I've never met in real life. They're all online friends. They're all these digital ghosts swirling about. And to me, that's really remarkable as well. But yeah, you know, it's a different landscape these days as well, as you mentioned earlier, Marko, through various factors. Funnily enough, I'm reading more books these days. So I have changed my position since that interview.
One of the most interesting things I always thought in Applied Ballardianism was the travel aspect. It's like there's a kind of internal journey going on, and there's a lot about the virtual world and the kind of specific sicknesses that virtuality introduces into the mind of the protagonist. But there's also this physical displacement, which is really important. It seems like you have to go, or the character has to go from one place to another in order to access certain, I don't know, memories, feelings, virtualities.
I mean,
well, yeah. I guess I saw my travels through social media as quite indistinguishable from the physical traveling as well. It was a matter of traveling through the digital realm, as corny as it sounds. Sorry, Marko, what were you about to say?
No, I mean, I just like it was good cue, because I wanted to like go back to Superstructure Berlin, because it's sort of a guidebook, right? And we could also, of course, talk about Applied Ballardianism as this sort of a guidebook, literally. And there's also like a new translation out at Urbanomic called Philosophy of the Theorist by Japanese author Hiroki Azuma. So clearly there's a very strong tendency there. On the other hand, I also like the sound of guidebook, because it kind of like also like refers to the self-help books, right? And I would say that Applied Ballardianism is a sort of also like a self-help book, meaning like a self-destroy book or like a perfect self-destroying mechanism book. So I was just wondering if the future of publishing is just publishing, you know, guidebooks and self-help books from now on.
First of all, can I say how do you see Applied Ballardianism as a self-help book? I'm interested in that concept.
I mean, if you don't want to survive, it's also like, you know, like how not to survive a century is also like a self-help book. Can be, right?
I mean, I would say, like, without getting too sincere and sentimental about it, that definitely helped me reading it. Like, it was a big kind of moment in my life when I read it, because I read that book, you know, probably 5 or 6 times, and kind of discovered new things every time. And it definitely somehow helped me to understand my diseased relationship with myself and the world. So it's probably helped other people. I mean, what's the point of a book if it's not going to, in some sense, like, if not help in a kind of cheery way, at least give you some kind of tools to deal with the reality that you're suffering?
Well, yeah, I mean, it definitely had that effect for me. It was writing as therapy, I guess. But I'm amazed that I'm amazed that something so depressive and inward and paranoid as Applied Ballardianism has found an audience. And to me, that is great. It's flattering, but it's also remarkable. Because you know, I can read through passages of that book and find exactly the mind state I was in at the time and think, wow, that is you know, a very, very depressing piece of writing. So, but I guess it other people have recognized similar impulses.
There's a kind of persistency, which is admirable, I think. Like, no matter how bad things are, just keep going.
But how much of it is in the mind state of the narrator as well? So yeah, I guess it's also, you know, well, maybe it is self-help, Marko, in the sense that it's constantly trying to escape that paranoid mindset and step out of yourself to some extent. And yeah. So maybe it is. I think that you both are able to explain the book far better than I am. To be very honest, much of my motivations for writing it and understanding it are very mysterious to me, even to this day.
Yeah, I mean, you also go to the Netherlands, and you know, like a human living there, like in the Netherlands, Spinoza was actually wrote the best help book, probably, right, of all times. Yeah. Ethics. So yeah, can you hear me? So yeah, we're good. You can hear me, right? Yeah. So Simon, you have like tuned into the signal. So that's the cue for my next question. That was like a big dimension of translating your novel, was like finding all the repetitions, like, right, because they are literally like the same all over the book, and you have to find all of them, you know, if you have to get it, if you want to get it as perfect as you want. So like the main one, of course, tune into the signal, or something will happen over there, but not just words, also gestures, like, for example, characters stepping their temples, right, or side of their nose. So these words, we could say like they're kind of magic words, and they actually operate like incantations. Yes, yeah, it's a big word for me. And these magic words are actually like they are the very mechanism that is opening these portals into the parallel worlds, right? And we could say like this shamanic dimension used to have a strong home in poetry, but is now like kind of moving away to code and programming and so on. And I would say that like your novel, Code Beast, like your second novel, is in this precise sense, it's like a passage from, you know, from one to the next. So we should probably start with the ending of Applied Ballardianism. As you say, Simon, you were always like bothered by people not talking about the last chapter too much. You know, like you always say, like no one talks about the ending. You know, like it completely changes.
Well, no one does, and it makes me wonder if people have read it to the end, because the last chapter of Applied Ballardianism is pure science fiction, and it's such a tonal shift to everything that came before.
Didn't we have like really, really super long discussions about what to do with the last chapter, and kind of kept on changing it? And
I think that's your beef between science fiction and non-science fiction, between like 5 minutes ahead, or you know, like a dick kind of way, like moving away. You know, like I think you have like I think there's a good debate in that. Could you like expand?
Well, for me, the last chapter suggests that the whole book is science fiction. I mean, how else are we meant to explain a book where this guy is seeing UFOs, he's doing occult rituals, he's feels like he's traveling sideways in time. But to me, the last book, the last chapter of the book, I just wonder though why it's never discussed as this sort of twist in the tale that sort of upends the whole narrative. It's just curious to me. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Because maybe the problem is more compelling than the solution.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe it just doesn't matter.
I was going to ask you something about this question of codes, Simon, because every time I talk to Reza about Psychonopedia, he always says to me, "Oh, there's things in there that people still haven't worked out. Like there's these codes and stuff in the footnotes, or there's relations between parts of the book that no one's still understood or recognized." Do you have, like, in your mind, a completely coherent map of what's happening in Applied Ballardianism?
Well, I think I do now that I've written the second book, Code Beast, because to me that is it's a direct. This is why I'm sort of fixated on this last chapter, because to me the new book is a direct correlation from the very last line of Applied Ballardianism, and without wanting to give away the ending for people who haven't read Applied Ballardianism, he undergoes a sort of experimental technology where his memories are scrambled with artificial memories. So the new book picks up from that and is in the same sort of cosmology as that. And I've seeded references to Applied Ballardianism all throughout the new book as well. Some are explicit and some are not, are coded and hidden away. So I think while I was writing Applied Ballardianism, because the process of Applied Ballardianism was really cobbling together all of the writing I'd ever done. So it brought together elements of my travel writing, it brought together elements of my PhD, it brought together elements of my fiction writing, and some of these were lifted wholesale from other things that I'd written in this different register and mashed them all together. And it's only when I wrote that last chapter to Applied Ballardianism that I'd started to think of it as a universe of its own. And that was a sort of, I guess, gestational stage of that. And then the new book is really expanding that universe into a realm of artificial memories and digital ghosts and hauntings and so on. So, and in fact, some of those same characters even reappear briefly in the new book as well. So yeah, I think, yeah, there are secret references throughout both books, and it is rapidly expanding into a universe.
Yeah, I find it interesting that you like sort of like say that like the last chapter is like the meta level, you know, like the ultimate, because like you mentioned, the second novel is also like in this kind of like you said, like if the first novel is Ballardian, like the second one should be like more like Philip K. Dick one. And then like I think like the exact point of Dick is there is no meta level, you know, there's always like simulation within simulation within simulation. So in that regard, I also read Applied Ballardianism. Also like the last chapter can be just like another, you know, simulation or another paranoia or another, you know, register of the registers.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's true. I think it is worlds within worlds, zones within zones. And I think, the way I sort of see it now is all those various versions of my life, being the travel writer, being the academic, being the fiction writer, are all worlds within worlds as well. And they're all sort of parallel realities. I agree with that view that that's just normality. That it's levels of simulation upon simulation, especially when it comes to trying to define myself and what exactly it is I do for a living, which comes back to the figure of the charlatan. I mean, I feel like I've sabotaged my writing career so many times that I don't really know what it is that I do anymore. I've been through all these various phases, and I'm sort of a ghostly version of myself at times.
But over the time, you're also like more detached, considering all your work, right? I think I can presume that like in the past you had like many issues with you writing for A Lonely Planet, and now you have like a different perspective to it after including it into a novel and everything.
Do I have a different perspective of it?
Yeah. I mean, less judgmental, I'd say.
Yeah, well, travel writing is an interesting discipline. It's
I mean, you also like it also, like while you were there, you were all already doing like this meta guides, like the Micronations guide was like a sort of a spoof and the guides at the same time, right?
I mean, it's always, I think all of my writing has always been about me trying to break in some sort of fictional element into it, or some sort of meta element into it. And I think when I was starting off, that came from this naive belief that I could write fiction. I mean, even though I call my books novels, I don't really fully see myself as a fiction writer. It's certainly, I don't think I have the talent to write fiction like a lot of other people. And so that's where it sort of came. I think that's where this impulse to graft it onto other forms has come from as well. So, always having this sort of maybe egotistical impulse to think that I could write fiction, but being stuck in other modes of writing and then trying to graft it on. In the early days, produced some very embarrassing results. But now I think even the new book Code Beast, which I think is a sort of pure science fiction novel, still has these sort of very vague, ghostly, theoretical trace impulses in it. I can't really escape that. So I think I've arrived at a sort of point where I can meld my sort of this still very egotistical impulse to think that I can write fiction. I think I've arrived at a point where I can sort of, relatively seamlessly fit that in with this other stuff that I do as well.
Maya, do you have anything to add here?
I was just wondering whether you can actually do such a thing as pure science fiction now, because the future is so like tightly looped into the present now.
Yes. No, I agree. That's I mean, I said in another interview I did recently that I see Code Beast as just another alternative memoir of my life, the same way that Applied Ballardianism is, even though it's it's this virtual reality world and deals with various forms of artificial intelligence. It's pretty much my experience of being a middle-aged man and in a digital world and growing old in the digital world, and all of the sort of anxieties and paranoia that come from that. Also watching my two young kids grow up in a fully online and fully digital world. There's these various forms of enhanced children in the new book that experience this sort of forced growth within a digital realm. With varying results. And so it's I totally agree with that I don't really think that you can sort of stand outside of the science fiction genre and say, well, that's what I write. When we're in the age of ChatGPT and so on.
It's actually like a testament to the ambiguity of your writing and the characters that it just now occurs to me to ask you, would you say you're a techno-optimist or techno-pessimist? Because I actually don't know.
No, optimist. Well, not optimist. I mean, I see myself more as an observer, I guess. I don't have like, for example, the whole thing about ChatGPT affecting writers and so on, and taking away writers' jobs and so on. I don't really feel that sort of pessimism. I can remember similar arguments being made about social media, things like that. I think I go back to what you said earlier, Maya, that you have to fully embrace these things and see what it does to you and see what happens through it. And I've been experimenting with all of the artificial intelligence technologies that come along, and that's fed into the new book as well. I think I've been nothing if not adaptable in the face of technological change. I've tried to adapt to whatever trends have come along and shifted my career trajectory appropriately. So in that sense, I think, I do agree with what you said earlier, that you can't really be interested in the future or say that you're a futurist or have any sort of interest in any of that without experiencing these things and seeing what happens, using yourself as a sort of experiment, I guess. So I'm not welded to any sort of traditional idea of the writer or publishing or whatever, and I'm sort of interested and sort of morbidly fascinated to see where these new developments take us.
Yeah, because probably like Maya try to say, or I'm thinking out loud, is that like the science fiction we used to know would be a retro form by now. Like this kind of envisioning future would be like a retro form by now. But I want to quote Maya's great text, Hyperplastic Supernormal, which I keep on rereading, and it goes like this, and it's about Ballard, and like, I will read it. Ballard belongs to the professional demographic, as do his heroes, and what prevails in his fables is an appealing yet somewhat dated Nietzschean conception of human creativity. The protagonist is a sovereign agent with a heroic capacity to conduct controlled experiments on himself through deliriously instinctive détournements of the technological media environment. In actuality, the position of the laborer-consumer drone may have been a more suitable perspective from which to anticipate the way in which machinic slaving would isolate and manipulate neurological responses operating below the conscious cognitive grasp of users, conceived as generic bundles of fixed action patterns. Extend them supernormally, thus creating an environment riddled by compulsion, addiction, and the monotonous domination of the same few stereotype supernormal stimuli. End of quote. It almost feels as though Maya is here describing a passage from Applied Ballardianism to Code Beast, and I think there's also like Simon automatically replying to all of this. Just two quotes from Code Beast. The first one, Pearl, that's a character, right? Pearl collects conspiracy theories, he monetizes them, turns them into zones, recruits others to inhabit them under his iron rule of course. And the second quote goes against that. I prefer to wallow in useless ideas rather than something with commercial potential. So for a start, I'm really interested in what Maya thinks of this last sentence.
Did you base a character on me?
Well, first of all, I just want to quickly say that you can clearly see the links to Applied Ballardianism there. I think it's like I'm still writing in that register. Anyway. Sorry, Maya, go on.
I'm just interested that, yeah. Okay.
What was there a question attached?
Yeah. I mean, what do you think about like this? I prefer to wallow in useless ideas rather than something with commercial potential. Useless, of course.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously,
being ambivalent.
Yeah, that's obviously something I identify with. Yeah, I don't know. It was interesting to hear that. I must say, I owe that that insight into Ballard from someone else, to Sean Lewin, who I was talking to about Ballard, and he said this, you know, all of Ballard's heroes are these professional types, and yeah, there is something in that they are kind of triumphal romantic characters who, yeah, there's something a bit dated about that. So I'm kind of interested now in rereading Ballard with a view to understanding where the limits of his model are. Like, where can't he take us? Because he's obviously, I mean, extraordinary insights that, you know, you can hardly look around the world today without thinking, you know, that's Ballardian, that we can take that for granted. But where are the limits of his model? Where are we going where Ballardianism actually doesn't work anymore? And maybe that's, again, the transition from applied Ballardianism into Code Beast.
Well, aren't we sort of post-Ballardian now? It's just, you know, it's a sort of a cliche to say it, isn't it? That the world is Ballardian. Primarily I see it as a observational mode, sort of anti-flaneur, I guess. Ballardianism, whatever it is. I mean, certainly he can't define it in my narrator can't define it in the book, and sort of tears him apart. But I'd be interested to know what you think Ballardianism is, actually.
So before our last question, it's already late. I would kindly ask you, Simon, to read an excerpt from your novel, and we will do it like a coupling, you know. Simon will read an English original excerpt, and then I will read the Slovenian version.
Okay, so let me just find it. So, so I do want to, after we do this, Marko, I do want to ask you about your, you know, if we have time, I want to ask you about your process of translation, because I find.
Oh yeah, okay, we can come to that if you're not too tired, of course. I would like to, if you want.
Yeah, if we have time, because you know, as an author, you're putting your trust in the hands of a translator. I don't read or speak Slovenian, but I trust you and I trust your vision. I'd love to talk more about that process. But shall we do the readings?
Oh, no, we could do that. I mean, it's a good introduction. I think like the great thing about this series that we're kind of doing just books with live authors being on Twitter and stuff, you know, so you can, you know, like when I had like some issues, dilemmas about translating some stuff, and there were many, as you can recall. I asked you, did the Italians ask you anything about, did they have any dilemmas? And you said, no, they have never contacted. And I was like, how the fuck do you do that? You know, we even like, you know, we even found maybe 5 or 6 mistakes in the novel, you know, which we like edited out. So I was really, and then I just went, I mean, it's not polite of me, perhaps when I had like dilemmas, I went to the Italian translation, I just said, oh, they just, you know, like threw away the dilemma. They just moved away from it, you know, like they just passed it by, you know. And I was really not, because you're alive, I was really not satisfied with that solution, right? So we had like 2 also seances, right, about it, because there were so many sentences I wanted to go through. Sorry for that, but at the end I was really satisfied that. But you know, like I'm like translating 5-6 years. I'm junior level, but I would say that like I'm interested in 2 paradigms. You know, like one is like more the dominant one, translate the work as though it was written in the language into which you translate, right? Like I should like translate this novel as though it was written in Slovenian, right? I'm very much interested in that, but at the same time I always have like this Walter Benjamin side to it, you know, like translate it literally, because that's like an opportunity to infect your mother language with the Xeno stuff, you know, like my first big translation was Meltdown, you know, right, Nick Lenz. So there I wanted to do it as literally as possible, right? But to keep the rhythm, but it was like a breakdown of the structure of the language, right? But here it was like the rhythm of your novel is so beautiful to me, the rhythm and the tempo, right? That I just wanted to translate that as closely as possible, but to retain the fluidity, right? So the exactness and the fluidity, that was like the balance I had to find, right? So that was like the most, so like after translating the first chapter, I was terrified. I was like, this. But after a while, I saw like the first chapter was your like David Fincher moment. It was like Fight Club, you know, first 5 minutes. It's like the most condensed, you know, cut, you know, like shortcuts possible. And then you kind of, you know, it kind of, you know, it becomes less dense. So I was able to translate it within 6 months, you know. If the whole thing was written, you know, like the first chapter, I would probably be still translating it, I guess, yeah.
Mm. Oh, well, I'm very grateful. I mean, it sounds like from the reviews in Slovenia that it's been very well received. I was interested that that the title translates as useful Ballardianism.
Yeah.
Which to me is maybe even a better title than Applied Ballardianism.
That's the self-help book, you know, aspect I was talking about, you know, because we say useful science. I mean, I could of course translate it as a applied science, you know, like we have applicative, but you know, it's a novel. It would be stupid if you ask me, you know, because it's not like it's not an academic theory book, you know. So, for example, also like when you talk about self, we have a horrible like German kind of word, Selbstwa. So there is no Selbstwa in your novel. It's just ego. It's just I. So whenever you talk about self, it's I. It's never Selbstwa, because it will just ruin the whole, according to me, you know, novels. So there's no Selbstwa at all. Maybe at the conference, if one bastard was talking about, I would, you know, if the Derrida guy was talking about self, I would use it there, but that would be like, that would be the only case. But he doesn't talk about self, so, you know, it doesn't happen, I think, yeah, as far as I can remember.
Yeah, it's it's just interesting as an author, the whole I mean, my book's been translated twice now, and yeah, it's, you know, you do as an author, you're giving your baby over to someone, and
sure.
And putting
and there, you know, we had also like funny moments when you just quote something, and then I get fucked because one technical term, you know, which you know, like we didn't know about, like there were like these basins of water near the airport, right, Heathrow, and like Ballard just, you know, just quotes, just like mentions a word in his novel, you know, like the one that you know, that copulates with all the people and flora and fauna. And there's just this one word, and you cannot get to know what this fucking word is. So you go to the Italian translations and also the Italian translations of Ballard, and they don't use the technical word. They just, you know, skip it. So then I was then communicate with people at the universities, and then I found the solution myself. But you know, I just went through the, and that's one word which is like completely irrelevant, you know, for the. But the great thing was that in Slovenia we also say about these basins that they are pools. So it was like a lovely Ballardian minimal, you know, detail where you in Slovenia also say some kind of pool for that. So you know, like there are like pools everywhere in Slovenian too for the Ballardian language. But yeah, enough of me. Sorry.
No, it's great. Thank you. I'm very.
You should read now.
Okay. So yeah. So Marko asked me to choose an extract from Applied Ballardianism to read, a short extract, and then he's going to read the Slovenian equivalent. The passage I've chosen is when the narrator is well, he's been prescribed a series of psychotropic pills, I guess, throughout the book that affect his mind state and his sense of reality, and he while he's under the influence of this medication, he is driving his car around Melbourne's motorways, and he's thinking about the first Mad Max film, a very Australian vision of car society. And so the passage I'm going to read is that reflection on Mad Max and how it affects his mind state. So, Mad Max's director, George Miller, developed the film script after experiencing two threshold moments. During the global oil crisis at the mid-70s, he read in the newspaper about frustrated motorists who turned feral at a Melbourne petrol station, attacking each other for the last drops of fuel. Later, working as a doctor in Melbourne, he treated numerous road accident victims and was struck by the nightmarish intensity and frequency of the crashes. For Miller, these events were interconnected, as if the city had been possessed by a malevolent force. In the 70s, drink driving was horrifyingly common in Melbourne, frequently accompanied by savage aggression. There were so many road deaths, around 1,000 every year, that Miller said it was as though we were operating under some immutable law of nature. We make funny noises, but none of us really understands what's happening, Miller said. The USA has its gun culture, we have our car culture. Mad Max upholds this view of technological carnage as natural law. After Max's wife and son are slaughtered on the open road by a biker gang, he seeks revenge. He steals the police force's fastest car, a Ford V8 Interceptor, and brutally kills the bikers one by one, running them off the road or chaining them to homemade bombs. Max has been stripped of his humanity, savaged by the ongoing car wars and hopelessly addicted to speed and violence. He's like a kid in a candy store when he first sees the Interceptor. He has become as psychotic as the gang he hunts, and when he walks into police headquarters to retrieve his secret weapon, a clever screen wipe shows the Interceptor instantly driving back out, replacing the broken man from a moment before, as if Max has become the machine. To Melbournians, Mad Max is not a fiction film, but a documentary. As I waited within the confines of my car for the end to arrive, I replayed that screen wipe in my mind. Melbourne's killing fields, an immutable law. We make apocalyptic noises, but we'll never understand. I imagined myself propelled to my death by forces I could not fathom, just like the victim in Ballard's Crash, who smashes into the narrator's car and is hurled through the windscreen, striking the car's bonnet. In that frozen moment, as Ballard, as the narrator is also called, watches the man die, a pattern forms on the victim's hand, puffed up into a huge blood blister, the Triton signature of the car's radiator emblem. This stark incident underscores a key insight of the narrator's acid trip. When incomplete bodies, fractured by the demands of capitalism, are rebuilt, they're bound together by the signs and symbols of banal technology. And as my disordered mind aligned this with the ciphers of Melbourne's auto death, I received a personal epiphany. Miller's immutable natural law was inextricably linked with my own pathetic death drive, with the reason I'd been prescribed the accursed pills in the first place. Even before reading Crash, I'd been fully primed by Mad Max and Australia's nasty road safety ads, so that when Ballard's novel finally revealed its secrets to me, I experienced a mighty temporal shift, the outline of my physical body sinking out of phase with my soul, ontological layers rubbing together and moving apart again like tectonic plates. I placed my hands under the dull luminescent glow of the car's dashboard display. They took on a purplish hue, as if I'd photosynthesized the electric light through the skin. I sat there for hours, minutes or seconds, basking in the purple light until the car battery had drained and the dashboard glow was no more, until my skin was full, head to toe, and I could no longer recognize myself.
Thank you. Režiser pobesnelega Maxa, George Miller, je scenarij dejansko razvil potem, ko je doživel dva prelomna trenutka. Med svetovno naftno krizo sredi 70-ih let je v časopisu bral o razdraženih motoristih, ki so podivjali na melbournski bencinski črpalki in se spopadli za zadnje kaplje goriva. Pozneje je kot melbournski zdravnik obravnaval številne žrtve prometnih nezgod, pri čemer ga je presunila morasta intenzivnost in pogostost trkov. Ti dogodki so bili po Millerju povezani, zdelo se je, kot da bi mesto obsedla zla sila. V 70-ih je bila vožnja pod vplivom alkohola grozljivo običajna stvar, pogosto je spremljala divja agresija. Žrtev prometnih nezgod je bilo toliko, približno 1000 let na leto, da je Miller dejal, da se je zdelo, kot da delujemo v skladu z nekim nespremljivim zakonom narave. Spuščamo čudne zvoke, tudi nihče izmed nas čisto zares ne razume, kaj se dogaja. ZDA imajo svojo kulturo orožja, mi imamo svojo kulturo avtomobilov. Pobesneli Max potrjuje to stališče tehnološkega klanja kot naravnega zakona. Potem, ko mu motoristična tolpa na odprti cesti razmsari ženo in sina, se hoče maščevati. Ukrade najhitrejši avtomobil svoje policijske enote Ford v 8 Interceptor in motoriste brutalno pobija enega za drugim. Nekatere zrine s ceste, druge priklene na priložnostjo izdelane bombe. Max je oropan svoje človečnosti, od nenehnih cestnih vojn je podivjal ter je brezupno odvisen od hitrosti in nasilja. Ko prvi zagleda Interceptorje, je kot otrok v prodajalni sladkarij. Postal je tako psihotičen kot tolpa, ki je lovi, in ko na sedež policije pride po skrivno orožje, domiselnem preliv pokaže Interceptorja, kako nemudoma zapelje ven in nadomesti zlomljenega človeka, ki smo ga videli še trenutek poprej, kot bi Max postal stroj. Za Melbourčane pobesneli Max ni fikcija, temveč dokumentarec. Medtem ko sem znotraj meja svojega avta čakal na konec, sem si v glavi ponovno zavrtel tisti preliv. Melbournska polje smrti, nespremljivi zakon, spuščamo apokaliptične zvoke, vendar ne bomo nikoli razumeli. Zamišljal sem si, kako me v smrt poženejo sile, ki jih nisem mogel doumeti, kot žrtev v trku, ki trči v pripovedovalčev avto, na kar jo vrže skozi vetrobransko steklo in trešči v pokrov motorja. V tem zamrznem trenutku, ko Ballard opazuje, kako mož umira, se na žrtveni roki izoblikuje vzorec, napihnjen v velik krvav žulj, znamenje Tritona značke na hladilniku. Ta surovi pripetljaj počrta ključni uvid pripovedovalčega tripa. Ko so pomakljiva telesa, ki jih zlomijo zahteve kapitalizma, zgrajena na novo, jih povezujejo znaki in simboli banalne tehnologije. Ko je moj neuravnovešeni to uskladil številkami melbournskih avtov smrti, sem doživel osebno razodetje. Millerjev nespremljivi zakon narave je bil neločljivo zvezan z mojim lastnim patetičnim gonom smrti, z razlogom, zaradi katerega so mi sploh predpisali preklete tablete. Še preden sem prebral Trg, so me na to v celoti že preparirali pobesneli Max in tisti neprijetni oglasi za prometno varnost. In ko mi je Ballardov roman naposled razkril skrivnosti, sem izkusil mogočen časovni zasuk, tako da obris mojega fizičnega telesa ni več usklajen z mojo dušo. Ontološke plasti pa so se drgnile drugo ob drugo in se znova razmikale kot tektonske plošče. Roke sem položil pod medlo svetlikajoče se sije armaturne plošče avtomobila. Prevzele so škrlatni odtenek, kot bi skozi kožo fotosintetiziral električno svetlobo. Tam sem sedel ure, minute ali sekunde in se predajal škrlatni svetlobi, vse dokler se avtomobilski akumulator ni izpraznil in je armaturna plošča nehala sijati. Vse dokler moja koža ni bila napolnjena od glave do pet in se nisem več prepoznal. So, to finish about Australia, our second book was Primož Krašovec's Alien Capital, and the foreword was written by an Australian called Vincent Lee, right? And then our next book is Superstructure Berlin, written by a German living in Melbourne. Of course, our third book was written by an Australian called Simon Sellers. And of course, there's also like a lovely singularity called Amy Ireland, which is a strong part of Urbanomic right now. So I'm just wondering, what's with this Australia thing?
Well, I don't know. Australians are outsiders, really, aren't we? We're the charlatans you speak of. We're constantly looking in on the rest of the world. I don't know.
Do you want to come and answer that? Do you want a special guest star to give another answer to that question?
Yeah, no. How do you handle Australia in your home, Maya? Hi, Amy.
Hey, Simon.
Hi, Amy. Hello.
So Amy told me about it. You are probably just demons, you know, like haunting us in our sleep. The Australians, you are.
I think it could be a colonial thing, because there's a real lack of tradition, a lack of a sense of one's own culture, a feeling of being an imposter on someone else's land, and there's absolutely no ground. And so, like Simon said, there's a kind of aspect of being an outsider that goes along with that, but also just like not having a place where you automatically start from. You have to figure out where to start from scratch. And I think that's something that maybe connects a lot of the outsideness of Australian literature. That's just my 2 cents.
I would agree with that. Yeah, it's definitely how I felt growing up in Australia.
Yeah.
It's sometimes being Australian can be a very isolating experience.
But like also like Nicholas Hausdorff also told me that there's like a myth about island being Australia being an island of prisoners. That's actually there's just 10% of prisoners, and all the 90% are the guards. So during the COVID era, probably something according to that, or no?
Yeah. COVID era was quite remarkable in Australia, but yeah, that's another story.
Okay, so thank you both. If you have anything to add, otherwise, I mean, also like question from the audience, if anyone has any. Any questions? I guess it's 4 a.m. here too, so Simon, Maya, take care. Really, thanks a lot for this wonderful evening, at least for me. So I hope we see and hear each other soon.
Thank you,
else.
and
yeah.
I would just like to say thank you to both of you sincerely for both of you for bringing this book into the world in different ways. It's you know, it's been the most amazing creative collaboration that I've experienced, and you know, it's great that we're still here talking about it 5 years on. I'm really very grateful to both of you, and to everyone who's read the book, and everyone in Slovenia who will read the book. I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, congratulations on the translation.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's a great book, so it was just, you know, and I also like, I think it was like the first translation of the Urbanomic, you know, catalog into Slovenia. So that was like also the goal, you know, like there were two goals. One was that, and the other one, like at least, I mean, as important as that was that, yeah, for sure.
Cool.
So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a nice
you.
evening. Yeah.
Okay,
Bye.
goodbye. Thank you, everyone.